The week started the way some weeks seem determined to start, by reminding everyone that the world doesn't believe in taking turns. One headline alone would have been enough. Instead, they arrived in clusters, each one elbowing the last aside for attention. A hurricane slammed into Florida with terrifying force. Massive protests continued across Iran, with people risking everything simply to demand basic freedoms. Italy watched a far-right coalition rise to power, prompting yet another uncomfortable reminder that history doesn't always stay where you leave it. It's the kind of week that makes every news producer stare at a whiteboard and quietly wonder if they accidentally scheduled 3 months' worth of disasters into 7 days. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Britain decided it would be an excellent time to conduct a live experiment on its own economy. Now, I've always admired Britain's confidence. This is a country that can look directly at a complicated problem and say, you know what would help? A plan that sounds reassuring if you don't listen too carefully. That's essentially where Liz Truss entered the picture. She had only recently become Prime Minister, inheriting a country already dealing with soaring energy prices, rising costs of living, nervous financial markets, and a population that would have gladly accepted almost any sentence beginning with, "Here's how we're going to make things less expensive." Instead, what the public got was a carefully produced video filled with uplifting music, determined facial expressions, and sentences that somehow contained almost no information whatsoever. Watching it felt less like hearing an economic strategy and more like listening to someone describe the concept of optimism to an elevator. The music swelled, the camera shifted dramatically. There were multiple camera angles. Unfortunately, no one seemed entirely sure which camera Liz Truss was supposed to look into. She kept glancing somewhere between them, creating the unsettling impression that she was addressing an invisible ghost hovering just off screen. Then came the language. Britain would become successful. Talent would be unleashed. Energy would be unleashed. Enterprise would be unleashed. Everything, apparently, was about unleashing something. Which sounds exciting until you realise unleash is one of those political words that means absolutely anything. You unleash dogs. You unleash software updates. You unleash movie trailers. You don't generally unleash economic policy. Unless, of course, your fiscal strategy is simply opening every cage at the zoo and hoping capitalism sorts it out. Behind all those carefully chosen words sat the actual proposal. Huge tax cuts, not modest ones, not temporary ones. Large reductions, heavily benefiting the wealthiest people in Britain. The argument supporting the plan wasn't new. In fact, it was old enough that it probably qualified as vintage. The theory went something like this: lower taxes for the rich. They invest more. Businesses grow, jobs appear, prosperity spreads. Eventually, everyone benefits. If that sounds familiar, that's because versions of the same promise have been recycled for decades. It has survived economic crises, elections, recessions, textbooks, documentaries, countless debates, and approximately 1 billion dinner table arguments between relatives who stop speaking to each other every Thanksgiving. The idea is often summarised by one cheerful phrase: a rising tide lifts all ships. It's a beautiful metaphor. It also quietly assumes everyone owns a boat, because if you're standing waist deep in the water with no boat at all, hearing about the rising tide becomes considerably less comforting. One government ally tried defending the proposal during a television interview. The interviewer pointed out that someone earning around £1 million would receive an enormous tax reduction. That wasn't exactly disputed. Instead came the explanation. Well, if all you care about is how the tax cuts are distributed over the next couple of years, you probably won't like this package. But if you care about poor people, then you should. That's a fascinating defence. Imagine trying that logic anywhere else. This restaurant serves terrible food, only if your narrow-minded definition of food involves eating. Or, this parachute doesn't open. Well, if all you care about is landing safely, it somehow managed to sound less like an economic argument and more like someone insisting the obvious wasn't actually obvious. Financial markets, unfortunately, have a reputation for reacting to obvious things. They did not greet the announcement with applause. Quite the opposite. The pound dropped dramatically. Confidence evaporated. Investors panicked. The Bank of England stepped in to stabilise markets and prevent pension funds from spiralling into catastrophe. Think about that for a second. The country's central bank essentially sprinted onto the field carrying a fire extinguisher while the government's own economic plan was still smouldering nearby. That's not generally considered ideal. Governments usually hope financial markets react with phrases like encouraging signs or measured optimism, not deploy emergency intervention immediately. Then something even stranger happened. Liz Truss largely disappeared. Normally, after unveiling a controversial policy, a leader spends the next several days defending it. Interviews, press conferences, questions, statements, clarifications. Instead, Britain entered what felt like an unusually expensive game of hide-and-seek. Journalists kept asking where the Prime Minister was. Newspapers started making jokes. One front page essentially asked if anyone had seen her. It's difficult for a government to project confidence when the country's newspapers begin treating the Prime Minister like someone's missing Labrador. Hey, have you checked the garden? Maybe under the sofa cushions. Could she be behind the curtains? Meanwhile, members of her own political party began speaking with an honesty that's usually reserved for retirement speeches. One Conservative lawmaker reportedly described the situation as reckless. Another reportedly called it madness. Someone else suggested this government had somehow managed to surpass previous governments they already considered disastrous. That's an astonishing accomplishment. It's like finishing last in a race where everyone else drove off a cliff. Television reporters began receiving messages from politicians while still on air. You could practically watch their expressions change in real time. One anchor looked down at incoming texts, paused awkwardly, and admitted there were words she couldn't repeat on television. Imagine how bad a message has to be before a live broadcaster decides the safest option is simply to announce, well, I definitely can't read that. Personally, I would have loved to hear every text, not because I'm particularly nosy, mostly because I enjoy watching journalists desperately attempt professionalism while their phones are exploding. My cousin wants to know whether we're still meeting for dinner. Oh! And apparently a member of Parliament just used language that would make my grandmother faint. Less than a month into office, Britain's new Prime Minister had somehow accomplished something genuinely remarkable. She introduced a controversial economic plan, watched financial markets tumble, prompted emergency action from the central bank, disappeared from public view, and irritated members of her own party, all before most people had even memorised her cabinet. That's efficiency. Unfortunately, not the useful kind. Britain, meanwhile, has a unique talent for processing political chaos. Americans tend to yell. The French protest Britain's size, then quietly invents increasingly creative ways to describe catastrophe without technically sounding emotional. It's one of the country's greatest exports, along with detective shows where every village somehow contains 12 murderers. Eventually, the political storm settled just enough for another completely different piece of television to catch my attention. Not because it was important, because it was wonderfully bizarre. Queen Elizabeth II had recently passed away. Across Britain and much of the world, people reflected on her extraordinary reign. Ceremonies took place, tributes poured in, world leaders expressed condolences. Naturally, American shopping networks decided this was an excellent opportunity to sell shoes. Not metaphorically, literally. Hosts began explaining that the Queen had once worn a particular brand. Then they transitioned seamlessly into discussing comfort, elegant colours, diamonds and royal purple. Watching the segment felt like witnessing grief, translated by someone whose first language was retail. Our deepest sympathies. Also, these loafers are incredibly supportive. One presenter excitedly mentioned the Queen supposedly had assistants break in her shoes before she ever wore them. Apparently, royalty enjoyed the luxury of outsourcing blisters. Imagine having staff whose official responsibilities include suffering through uncomfortable footwear on your behalf. Somewhere, there must have been an employee introducing themselves at parties. So, what do you do? I wear shoes until they're emotionally ready. The presenter then smiled and announced viewers wouldn't need anyone to break these shoes in. Well, that's comforting. History may remember Queen Elizabeth for constitutional stability, 70 years of public service, and steering the monarchy through enormous change. Television retail apparently remembered her as someone with remarkably comfortable feet. And somehow, That wasn't even the strangest thing waiting later that evening. The strange thing about news is that it can take you from one subject to another so quickly your brain barely has time to change gears. 1 minute you're watching politicians argue over tax cuts. The next, someone is asking why an ancient marble foot is sitting hundreds of miles away from the rest of the statue it belongs to. That transition sounds ridiculous. It also turns out to be the perfect introduction to one of the biggest arguments museums have been trying to avoid for decades. Because eventually you stop asking, what is this artifact? And you start asking a much more uncomfortable question. How did it get here? If you've ever visited Greece, there's a good chance you've walked through the Acropolis Museum. It's stunning. Every room reminds you that human beings were carving masterpieces long before anyone thought adding Bluetooth to a refrigerator was a good idea. But if you're paying attention, something starts to look off. You'll see ancient sculptures where most of the stone has aged into a beautiful darker colour, except for one startlingly bright white section. Maybe it's a foot, maybe it's a torso, maybe half a face. At first glance, it almost looks like the museum is still waiting for replacement parts to arrive, like someone ordered the statue online and the final shipment got delayed. The white pieces aren't mistakes. They're placeholders. They're empty spaces marking pieces that aren't there anymore because the originals are sitting somewhere else. Specifically, many of them are sitting in London's British Museum. And that's where things get awkward. As a British institution, the museum has one of the most extraordinary collections anywhere on Earth. It also has one of the most extraordinary collections of uncomfortable origin stories. If humanity ever lost something valuable, there's a decent chance someone eventually wandered into the British Museum and said, "Oh, there it is!" Calling it a museum sometimes feels incomplete. It's more like history's largest lost and found department. Except the quotation marks around lost deserve their own museum exhibit. Take the famous Parthenon sculptures, often called the Elgin Marbles. Back in the early 19th century, Lord Elgin removed large sections from the Parthenon in Athens. Not borrowed, not carefully preserved with everyone's enthusiastic approval. Removed the Greeks have spent decades asking for them back, which seems understandable. If somebody removed half your family photo album and displayed it in another country, you'd probably have questions too. Instead, defenders of keeping the sculptures in Britain have occasionally offered explanations so astonishingly patronising they almost become performance art. One argument essentially suggested Greece couldn't be trusted to care for the sculptures properly. Another compared returning the marbles to allowing someone who mistreated one child to adopt another. Think about that comparison for a second. It accidentally admits something incredibly important. The first child wasn't voluntarily given away. It was taken. That's a very different conversation. It's amazing how often people accidentally undermine their own arguments simply by choosing the wrong analogy. History has a way of doing that. The deeper you look into museum collections, the less the debate becomes about beautiful objects and the more it becomes about power, because these aren't random souvenirs. They're pieces of civilizations, they're records, they're memories. Sometimes they're sacred. Sometimes they're still spiritually alive to the communities they came from, and yet they've often been treated as decorations with exceptionally long resumes. The scale is staggering. A report commissioned in France found that more than 90% of Africa's cultural heritage exists outside Africa in major museums and collections. 90%. Imagine someone taking 90% of your family's photographs, journals, heirlooms, and keepsakes, then explaining how fortunate you should feel because tourists can now admire them somewhere else. That argument has never sounded particularly persuasive. Not surprisingly, people have grown tired of asking politely. Some have started protesting directly inside museums. One Congolese activist even removed an African funerary object from a Paris museum during a demonstration against colonial plunder. Now, museums understandably have rules against removing artifacts. That's fair. But there's something almost impossible to ignore about watching institutions fiercely defend property rights concerning objects whose own histories involve questionable property rights. It's difficult to lecture someone about stealing after spending a century saying, well, technically, that's really what this entire debate comes down to. That word, technically. Technically, it was legal. Technically, the paperwork existed. Technically, ownership transferred. Technically, the law says... Technically, morality, unfortunately, has never been particularly impressed by technicalities. To understand why this issue refuses to disappear, you have to understand how some of these museums were built in the first place. The British Museum proudly tells visitors about its origins. Founded in the 18th century, one of the world's first great public museums. A place dedicated to knowledge, learning, discovery, Knodge. Those ideals sound wonderful, and honestly, they are. Museums absolutely can connect people across cultures. They can inspire curiosity. They can preserve incredible achievements. None of that is the problem. The problem begins when you ask where some of those collections actually came from. The museum's founding collection belonged largely to Sir Hans Sloane. He was an accomplished physician and collector, but he also benefited from wealth connected to Jamaican sugar plantations worked by enslaved people. That doesn't erase everything else he accomplished. It does complicate the story. History almost always becomes more complicated the closer you stand to it. Clean narratives are usually built from comfortable distances. Move closer, and suddenly every heroic portrait develops shadows. Perhaps no example illustrates that better than the Benin bronzes. Even calling them bronzes barely hints at what they really are. They're an enormous collection of plaques, sculptures, ceremonial objects, and artworks created in the Kingdom of Benin, located in what is now Nigeria. They aren't merely decorative pieces, they're historical records, visual archives. Each plaque preserves important moments, rulers, ceremonies, and achievements. Imagine replacing your nation's written history with magnificent metal sculptures. That's essentially what these objects became. Then imagine someone removing thousands of those pages from your library, because that's exactly what happened. In 1897, British forces invaded Benin. The city was attacked. The royal palace was looted. Buildings were destroyed. Thousands of artifacts were carefully gathered, photographed, stacked neatly, even labelled. The labels themselves almost become dark comedy. Imagine organising evidence so carefully that future generations can clearly identify it as looted property. That's not exactly subtle. It's almost administrative honesty. We took these. Should we write something else? No. Let's keep it simple. What makes the loss even more heartbreaking is what members of the Benin royal family have explained about those plaques. They weren't simply artwork. They functioned almost like diaries. Whenever something important happened, bronze casters recorded it. Every ruler, every ceremony, every achievement, every significant event. The palace walls told an organised story. Then soldiers removed the plaques, scattered them across the world, and destroyed the original order forever. Imagine taking every chapter of a history book, throwing the pages into the air, and asking future generations to reconstruct the narrative from pieces displayed in museums across dozens of countries. That's not preservation, that's fragmentation. Today, those bronzes are spread among more than 100 museums and institutions worldwide. Only a tiny number remain in Nigeria. That imbalance says almost everything. Generations of visitors in Europe have grown up admiring Benin's artistic brilliance. Meanwhile, many Nigerians have never had the opportunity to stand in front of the masterpieces their own ancestors created. One Nigerian artist described finally seeing an original Benin artwork in London. He felt enormous pride, then overwhelming sadness, because he realised most people from Benin would probably never experience what he was experiencing. That feeling is difficult to dismiss. Pride mixed with absence, recognition mixed with loss. Museums often describe themselves as places where humanity comes together. But whose humanity? And on whose terms? Whenever requests for repatriation arise, familiar responses quickly appear. The first usually argues that we can't judge historical actions by today's standards. People did things differently back then. The laws were different. War worked differently, ownership worked differently maybe. But even during those centuries, many people recognised looting as morally troubling. Following one British military expedition into Ethiopia in the 19th century, Britain's own Prime Minister publicly lamented that cultural treasures had been removed and argued they should eventually be returned. That's important because it reminds us this isn't simply modern morality rewriting history. Even contemporaries understood something valuable had been violated. Another common argument insists Western museums simply protect objects better. The claim sounds practical. These institutions have resources, climate control, conservation experts, security systems. Surely they're safer here, except reality complicates that story too. The British Museum itself has experienced water leaks affecting galleries. Conservation methods once included aggressively scrubbing ancient sculptures with wire brushes and harsh chemicals. Apparently, careful preservation once involved cleaning priceless marble the way someone attacks a rusty barbecue grill. That's less reassuring. If someone insists they're the ideal caretaker after accidentally damaging the thing they're protecting, skepticism feels reasonable. The final defence is probably the most familiar: universal museums. Places where the entire world can encounter humanity's shared heritage. It's an appealing vision. People from everywhere seeing everything, learning together, connecting across cultures. Wonderful idea. Until someone asks one inconvenient question. How much of the collection is actually on display? In Britain's case, roughly 1%. The museum owns around 8 million objects. Only about 80,000 are visible to visitors at any given time. That means millions of artifacts spend their lives underground in storage, carefully catalogued, carefully boxed, carefully forgotten. For communities searching for pieces of their own history, discovering those objects aren't educating anyone at all, but instead sitting on shelves in storage is difficult to justify. One museum visit in the United States captures that feeling perfectly. Representatives from Native American communities were shown collections held in storage. They walked through endless rows of boxes, artifacts belonging to their ancestors. Objects nobody had seen for years. Items removed from communities where they once held living meaning. One visitor quietly described feeling both anger and sadness, not because the museum existed, because the objects had effectively disappeared. Not into history, into storage. That image stayed with me. Rows and rows of shelves, thousands of carefully labelled boxes, entire cultures reduced to inventory numbers, waiting beneath fluorescent lights. Museums often describe themselves as guardians of memory. Sometimes they're also warehouses of absence. And once you recognise that, you start wondering whether the story ended decades ago. Unfortunately, it didn't. Because while many people assume these controversies belong entirely to colonial history, the international market for antiquities remains very much alive. Which means the next question isn't simply what museums collected a century ago. It's what they're still collecting today. And that story turns out to be every bit as surprising and every bit as unsettling. If the first half of this story asks how so many cultural treasures left their homes, the second half asks an equally uncomfortable question. Why does it keep happening? It's tempting to think the era of soldiers loading priceless artifacts onto ships ended with the colonial age. After all, we live in an age of international law, satellite imagery, customs agencies, digital records, and museums with mission statements about ethics. Surely we've moved beyond casually stripping history from one country and displaying it in another. Unfortunately, history has a remarkable ability to change its wardrobe without changing its habits. These days, the journey of a stolen artifact is usually quieter. Instead of armies, there are smugglers. Instead of warships, there are shipping containers. Instead of generals, there are dealers, collectors, auction houses, and paperwork. Lots and lots of paperwork. That's why one word becomes incredibly important in the world of antiquities. Provenance. In simple terms, provenance is an object's documented history. Where did it come from? Who owned it? When did ownership change? How did it leave its country of origin? Was that transfer legal? Was it ethical? Those questions aren't boring administrative details. They're the difference between preserving history and participating in theft. The strange thing is that many people in the art market openly admit provenance can increase an object's value. A fascinating ownership history can make an artwork even more desirable. Klopdrock's love stories, auction houses' love stories, museums' love stories, until, of course, the story becomes inconvenient. Then everyone suddenly becomes remarkably interested in not asking too many questions. One example involved a 1,000-year-old Cambodian statue that appeared at auction with an estimated value of several $1 million. Before the sale, the auction house's own expert reportedly warned that the sculpture had almost certainly been stolen. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, the piece was prepared for sale anyway. Imagine taking your car to a mechanic. The mechanic says, "Just so you know, this vehicle is definitely stolen." And your response is, "Interesting. Let's polish it before we put it on the lot." Eventually, federal authorities intervened. The statue was seized and returned to Cambodia, where it was reunited with the feet, still attached to the original temple. As strange as that sounds, it's a fitting image. For years, the sculpture had existed as two separate pieces. History had literally been cut apart. The reunion wasn't just symbolic, it restored part of the object's original meaning. That detail reveals something many people don't realise. When ancient statues are missing feet, hands or heads, the damage isn't always the result of time. Sometimes it's the result of speed. Looters often remove only the most valuable sections, hacking sculptures apart as quickly as possible before transporting them across borders. The missing pieces aren't accidents, they're evidence. That pattern appears again and again. In Nepal, investigators documented how dealers could obtain export paperwork through bribery. One dealer casually explained that paying the right people could make official stamps appear with surprisingly little difficulty. There was nothing elaborate about the explanation, no secret codes, no elaborate conspiracy, just money. That might be the most depressing part. We often imagine international trafficking as the work of criminal masterminds. Sometimes it's simply someone shrugging and saying, "I know a guy." When documentary filmmakers later asked representatives from a museum whether they had worked with one of those dealers, the response became awkward almost immediately. Instead of a quick no, there were pauses, consultations, and promises to check the records. To be fair, institutions deserve the chance to investigate carefully before answering. But from the outside, hesitation rarely inspires confidence. Eventually, the museum returned certain objects to Nepal after evidence showed they had indeed been stolen. The returns were significant, but they also raised another question. If these objects could be identified after years of research, how many others remain unidentified? That uncertainty hangs over museums around the world. Sometimes the problem isn't simply one questionable object. It's an entire collecting culture that rewarded people for asking too few questions. Few stories illustrate that better than the career of Subhash Kapoor. For years, Kapoor supplied museums and collectors with Asian antiquities. His donations earned respect. His reputation opened doors. Prestigious institutions proudly displayed objects associated with him. Then investigators concluded that Kapoor had been one of the world's most prolific traffickers of stolen antiquities. One of his favourite explanations for suspicious objects was almost comically simple. According to paperwork, many pieces supposedly came from his girlfriend's family collection. Apparently, this mysterious family possessed enough priceless antiquities to fill museum galleries. Somehow, that explanation kept working. Looking back, it almost feels unbelievable. But hindsight has a way of making yesterday's confidence look painfully optimistic. Even world-famous museums can make spectacular mistakes. One of the most public examples involved an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus purchased by New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. The coffin was magnificent. It quickly became one of the museum's celebrated acquisitions. Then something unexpected happened. During the 2018 Met Gala, Kim Kardashian posed for photographs near the coffin. Those images spread across the internet. Shortly afterward, someone familiar with the object recognised it and alerted authorities. The investigation revealed that the sarcophagus had been looted during the turmoil surrounding Egypt's 2011 uprising. Doxing on supporting its export turned out to be forged. Ownership histories conflicted with one another. Warning signs had been overlooked. Eventually, the museum returned the coffin to Egypt and acknowledged the mistake. It's difficult not to appreciate the irony. Years of paperwork, experts, acquisitions, and internal reviews failed to uncover the problem. Then one celebrity photograph triggered a chain of events that ultimately brought the truth to light. History works in mysterious ways. These cases aren't merely embarrassing for museums. They have real consequences. Trafficking in antiquities has helped finance violent organisations, criminal networks and armed conflicts. Every illegally excavated artefact destroys archaeological context that can never be reconstructed. Every undocumented object removes another page from humanity's shared historical record. And for many communities, the loss is deeply personal. In museums, an object may sit quietly behind glass with a small identification label. Back home, that same object may still be part of religious ceremonies, family traditions, or community identity. One sacred Nepalese statue spent years displayed as an art object in an American museum. When it was finally returned, it wasn't placed inside another glass case. People immediately welcomed it back into active religious worship. That difference says everything. One culture saw a sculpture, another saw something living. Perhaps the most moving example came from the University of Aberdeen. During a review of its collections, researchers traced the story behind a glass sphere connected to a Hindu holy man who had once undertaken a 12-year spiritual vow. He never completed it. Even more disturbing, the university discovered it also possessed his skull. The realization changed everything. Instead of seeing anonymous remains in a collection, curators recognized a human being whose final wishes and religious traditions had never been respected. Plans began to discuss returning those remains appropriately. That willingness to reconsider matters. So does honesty. Museums don't become weaker by acknowledging uncomfortable histories. If anything, they become more credible. No institution benefits from pretending difficult questions don't exist. Returning an artifact isn't an admission that museums themselves are bad. Museums remain extraordinary places. They educate millions of people. They preserve fragile objects. They inspire curiosity. None of those achievements disappear simply because ownership is re-examined. In fact, genuine collaboration may create something even better. Loans between countries, shared exhibitions, joint research, partnerships based on consent rather than conquest. Imagine visitors admiring an object while also learning that it remains the recognized cultural property of the people who created it. That feels less like losing history and more like finally telling it honestly. Ultimately, this conversation isn't really about marble, bronze, gold, or stone. It's about memory. Who tells history? Who owns memory? Who decides where identity belongs? Those questions don't have simple answers, but refusing to ask them isn't an answer either. History cannot be changed. The invasions happened. The looting happened. The collections were built. None of that can be undone. What can change is what we choose to do now. Whether we continue defending yesterday's injustices simply because they are old, or whether we acknowledge that preserving history sometimes means returning pieces of it to the people who never willingly gave them away. That isn't about erasing museums, it's about strengthening trust. It's about recognizing that cultural heritage isn't merely property, it's inheritance. And perhaps the greatest museums of the future won't be remembered for how much they possessed. They'll be remembered for how honestly they confronted the stories behind those possessions and how willing they were to share them with the world on terms rooted not only in law but in fairness. History belongs to everyone. But that doesn't always mean everyone gets to keep someone else's history forever.